A mother's last hope. Lara Thompson sat on the edge of the hard wooden bench in the courtroom, clutching her purse with both hands, trying to steady the rapid beat of her heart. Her knees shook slightly, and her throat was dry. She didn't belong here. At least, that's how it felt. She was just an ordinary woman, struggling to make ends meet, to do the best she could for her daughter, Emma. Yet today, she found herself in a place that felt foreign, where everything seemed to be out of her control. It wasn't like she'd done something truly awful. But life had a way of piling things on, and this particular pile had grown far too heavy to carry. $200. That was the fine. $200 she didn't have. Lara's fingers curled around the worn leather of her purse, the edges fraying slightly from years of use. Her eyes flickered toward the door of the courtroom, watching the other people who had been called before the judge. Their cases, from what she could hear, were all business-related, stiff, transactional. No one seemed to be worried like she was. But they didn't have Emma. Her gaze shifted to the small figure standing beside her. Emma, only 6 years old, was as quiet as a mouse, her big brown eyes wide with innocence. She held onto her mother's hand, the weight of the situation completely lost on her. Emma wasn't aware that this was a moment that could alter their lives forever. She didn't understand the burden of the fines that had spiraled out of control, or the frustration that came with struggling to provide even the most basic of needs. Lara had done everything she could to explain it to her daughter. The missed rent payments, the skipped meals, the silent tears at night. But how do you explain to a child that the world wasn't built to help people like them? How do you tell her that the things most people took for granted, an afternoon treat, a safe place to live, the luxury of not worrying about what might happen next, were things Lara had to fight for every day? As the courtroom continued its hum of activity, Lara couldn't help but feel small, invisible in the sea of faces around her. There was the clink of a pen against a notepad, the shuffle of papers being passed back and forth, and the low murmur of conversations between lawyers. Everything felt distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. And there, in the front of the room, sat Judge Callisto, his stern figure casting a long shadow across the entire space. He was an imposing man, the type who had built a reputation on being unyielding, a stickler for rules and regulations, and a firm believer that the law was the law. Lara had heard stories. He didn't have time for excuses. He didn't care about your background, your troubles, your circumstances. To him, there were no gray areas, just black and white. And right now, Lara couldn't help but wonder if that black and white worldview would be enough to bury her under the weight of this fine. Her fingers clenched around the fabric of her dress as the door to the courtroom swung open and another defendant was called up. One after the other, people were summoned to the judge's bench, their cases heard and dismissed, the penalties handed down. Some left with their heads held low. Others walked out, shaking their heads, the weight of their own misfortune hanging over them. Lara's mind raced. What if the judge didn't care about her story? What if he saw only a woman who couldn't even pay for something as simple as parking? What would Emma think if they left here today and had no food to eat? What would Lara say to her daughter when the weight of the fine forced them to give up their small apartment, the only home Emma had ever known? Her stomach twisted as the tension grew thicker. It was then that Emma, unaware of the gravity of the situation, looked up at her mother. Her innocent face was upturned, her eyes reflecting the kind of trust that could only come from a child who believed the world was a safe and predictable place. Emma tugged gently on Lara's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Emma whispered, her small voice cutting through the tense silence of the courtroom. "Can we get some hamburgers?" Lara's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at her daughter, the weight of the moment hitting her like a freight train. It wasn't that she hadn't fed Emma. Of course she had. But today was different. They had no money left for treats. She had no idea how they were going to make it through the next few days, let alone afford a meal. The tiny voice asking for something as simple as a hamburger seemed so innocent, so pure, but in that moment, it felt like the weight of the world was resting on her shoulders. Her chest tightened, and she glanced nervously toward the judge. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Even the murmurs of the audience came to an abrupt halt. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, Judge Callisto, who had remained silent, his eyes focused on the proceedings, looked up. His sharp gaze moved toward Emma, who stood innocently beside her mother, her eyes wide with curiosity. He raised an eyebrow, his stern face softening just slightly. "Did you say hamburgers, young lady?" Judge Callisto asked, his voice unusually gentle, a soft surprise in his tone. Lara's cheeks turned crimson. She quickly dropped to her knees beside Emma, whispering hurriedly into her daughter's ear, "Sweetheart, it's not polite to interrupt the judge. Please be quiet for now." Emma's face fell, but she nodded. Lara's heart ached at the sight. She hated the way she had to constantly remind Emma of the things a child should never have to worry about. It wasn't the first time Lara had to shield her from the harsh realities of their life. But as Lara stood, she stole a glance at Judge Callisto. The courtroom waited in absolute silence. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, judging, scrutinizing. They all must have thought she was a bad mother, a failure. After all, what kind of parent brought their child into a courtroom without proper preparation, without the ability to pay the fines that had led them here in the first place? But Lara wasn't a failure. She was trying, every single day. Trying to keep her daughter safe, trying to make sure Emma knew she was loved, even when the world seemed to be doing everything it could to break them apart. Judge Callisto's gaze softened just a little as he surveyed the scene. "Well, young lady," he said, addressing Emma, "I think we can work something out, but we'll need to hear from your mother first." Lara's heart skipped a beat. Was he going to dismiss the fine? Was he going to give her a chance? She wasn't sure, but for the first time today, a glimmer of hope sparked inside her. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. But as the silence dragged on, Lara couldn't help but wonder what the judge was really thinking. And more importantly, what kind of decision he would make in a case like hers. A mother doing her best, a daughter asking for something so simple, yet so important. What would happen next? The weight of the world. The courtroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed on Lara's chest like a heavy weight. She could feel every breath she took, shallow, shaky, and the pounding of her heart was deafening in her own ears. As the Judge Callisto, sat high at the bench, his eyes never left the stack of paperwork in front of him. He was reviewing something. Every so often, his sharp gaze would flicker to the room, scanning the people before him like he was assessing a puzzle he already knew the answer to. Lara's gaze wandered over the polished floor, the beige walls, the flickering fluorescent lights above. She tried to focus on anything but the growing pressure in her chest. This wasn't how she had imagined her day going. She had hoped, desperately, that the judge might understand her situation, that maybe, just maybe, he would see that she was just a mother trying to do right by her daughter. But with each minute that ticked by, the reality of the situation weighed heavier on her. The $200 in fines felt like an insurmountable mountain. It was a product of a series of unfortunate events, the kind of thing that anyone could experience but few would ever talk about. A parking ticket here, a missed payment there, a slip-up in judgment when life was already hard enough. The bills piled up like the dishes in the sink, and with each fine that went unpaid, the interest grew. Now she was here in court, facing a penalty she couldn't afford and hoping that the judge would somehow show mercy. But nothing was ever certain in court. Mercy wasn't a given. And Judge Callisto was known for being tough. In fact, he had a reputation for being stern, even harsh. He rarely showed leniency, especially for those who couldn't afford to pay their fines. Lara had heard rumors about him. How he was unyielding, how he didn't care about excuses, how the law was the law, and that was it. She had hoped it wouldn't be the case with her, but deep down, she feared it might be. Lara looked at Emma again, her little girl still holding her hand, clutching it so tightly that Lara could feel the warmth of her palm through her skin. Emma's innocent eyes were wide, her hair bouncing lightly with each of her mother's slow movements. Lara smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. She was fighting back tears, the anxiety curling in her stomach like a tight knot. Her little girl didn't understand any of it. She didn't understand the weight of the fines or the desperate phone calls to utilities, begging for more time. She didn't understand how her mother hadn't been able to put together a decent meal for the last few days because money was so tight. She didn't understand why her favorite cereal wasn't on the shelf when they went shopping, or why they were eating sandwiches every night. But Emma knew one thing. Her mother had always told her that everything would be okay. Every night after tucking her into bed, Lara would whisper, "It's all going to be okay, sweetheart. You'll see." But what if it wasn't going to be okay? What if the weight of everything broke her, broke them both? The thought lingered in the back of Lara's mind, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't afford to break down, though. Not now. Not in front of the judge. Not in front of Emma. Her thoughts were interrupted by the loud crack of the judge's gavel, his voice booming across the room. "Order in the court." The room stilled immediately, and for a moment, Lara's heart nearly stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, and she could feel every set of eyes in the room turning toward her and Emma. The whispers and murmurs from the crowd seemed to echo through her skull, and she couldn't help but feel exposed, as though everyone in the room was judging her. "Proceed," the judge commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. He looked down at the paperwork in front of him, shuffling the papers with a slight frown on his face. Lara cleared her throat, trying to steady her nerves. Her attorney had briefed her on how to present her case. Briefly, clearly, with as much humility as she could muster. But now, with the weight of all those eyes on her, she felt like she might collapse. She wasn't sure if she could do this. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, a small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy, I'm hungry," the voice said, high-pitched and innocent. Lara's heart nearly stopped. Her stomach sank. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Emma had spoken. She hadn't meant to. She never did things like this. But there she was, standing next to her mother in the courtroom, her wide brown eyes glistening with innocence, looking up at her with that familiar, trusting gaze. She had no idea what was at stake. She didn't understand that her simple request could derail everything. Lara's face flushed deep red with embarrassment. She quickly bent down, her hand gently cupping Emma's shoulder, whispering hurriedly, "Sweetheart, not now. Please, not here." But the damage had already been done. Every head in the courtroom had turned. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, and the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even the judge, usually unmoved by the smallest distractions, paused and turned his attention toward Emma. The room was tense, everyone waiting for the judge's reaction. For a brief moment, Lara feared the worst. Would the judge be furious? Would he see Emma's innocent question as a sign of irresponsibility on her part? Would he think she was an unfit mother because she couldn't even keep her daughter quiet in such an important moment? But then something unexpected happened. Judge Callisto didn't frown. He didn't scold. Instead, his brow furrowed just slightly, and a flicker of curiosity passed through his eyes. He set the papers down in front of him, and for the first time since the court session began, his gaze softened just a little. "Did you say you're hungry, young lady?" he asked, his voice not as harsh as before. It was a simple question, but the gentleness in his tone caught Lara off guard. Emma nodded, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Yes, I want hamburgers. And fries," she added, her eyes sparkling as she gripped her mother's hand tighter. Lara's face flushed even deeper. She whispered urgently to Emma, trying to get her to stop. But Emma was too innocent, too pure to understand the magnitude of what she had just done. Lara's eyes flickered back to Judge Callisto, anxiety bubbling up inside her. Had her daughter just ruined everything? But the judge, to Lara's surprise, simply sat back, his gaze never leaving Emma. There was no anger, no impatience. In fact, There was a faint, almost amused glint in his eyes, like he had just heard a joke he hadn't expected to. For a long moment, the room was silent. Even the murmurs of the crowd stopped. Everyone waited to see what Judge Callisto would do. Would he dismiss them immediately? Would he charge them even more for wasting his time? Or would something else happen? Lara was too nervous to even breathe. She just stared at the judge, her heart pounding in her chest, and waited for the outcome of this unexpected moment. The unseen child. Lara's hands trembled as she watched the clock on the wall tick forward, each second echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, but it felt like an eternity. She felt as if every inch of her soul was exposed, laid bare before the judge, the court, and even the universe. The room seemed to close in on her, the heat rising, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. Judge Callisto, as stern as ever, was focused on the papers before him, flipping through each page with meticulous care, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lara's eyes flicked from him to Emma, who was standing quietly beside her, holding her hand so tightly that Lara could feel the pressure. The little girl's head barely reached Lara's waist, her tiny body still soft with the innocence of childhood. She was a part of Lara's strength, the reason she kept going through all the hardships. But now, Emma's presence, so pure and unbothered, made Lara feel even more vulnerable. Lara had hoped that bringing Emma along might help soften the atmosphere. After all, what kind of judge could remain cold to a mother and her child? She had even dressed Emma in her best Sunday dress, the one with the little pink bows on the sleeves, hoping that the sight of her might stir something in the judge's heart. But now, as the minutes dragged on, all she could think was how foolish it had been. Emma wasn't the problem. Lara was, and as the situation grew more intense, Lara felt the creeping suspicion that this whole scenario, with its judge and courtroom, was a battle that she couldn't win. The murmurs of the crowd in the gallery were faint, but Lara could hear them. The soft whispers about the case, the speculation on the outcome. She hated it. She hated how they might be judging her too, as though she was just another statistic in the broken system. But the truth was, Lara was simply trying to survive, and Emma, the light of her life, was the only reason she hadn't given up yet. Order in the court. Judge Callisto's voice thundered, snapping Lara out of her thoughts. The sound of his gavel slamming down reverberated through the room like a sudden storm, and the gallery fell silent at once. Lara's body stiffened involuntarily, but she quickly regained her composure. She focused her gaze on the judge, who had now turned his attention fully to them. The room felt heavy, like all the air had been sucked out. Judge Callisto's sharp eyes met hers. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice measured but firm, "do you have anything more to add, or are we ready to proceed with the verdict?" Lara swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but the weight of the moment made it all seem impossible. She tried to speak, but before the words could form, a small, unexpected voice broke through the tense silence. "Mommy," came a high-pitched voice from beside her. It was Emma. Lara turned in shock to see her daughter looking up at her with big, innocent eyes, her lips forming a soft pout. "Mommy, I'm hungry. Can we have hamburgers?" For a moment, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Lara's heart sank. What had Emma just said? Did she really just ask for hamburgers right now, in the middle of all this? She looked around, her face flushed with embarrassment. The gallery, which had been quiet moments before, now buzzed with muted murmurs. Some people turned their heads away, trying not to laugh, while others exchanged looks of surprise. It wasn't the kind of interruption anyone would expect to hear in such a serious setting. Lara's chest tightened as she turned toward Emma, her heart sinking. She quickly bent down to her daughter's level, her voice low and urgent. "Emma, sweetheart, please," she whispered, her tone firm but gentle. "Not right now, okay? We're in court." But Emma wasn't deterred. Her wide eyes, full of innocence, stared back at her mother, unbothered by the tension in the air. "But Mommy, I'm really hungry." I want a hamburger. Emma's small hands gripped Lara's, tugging her gently, still not fully grasping the magnitude of what was going on around them. Lara felt a wave of heat flood her face, a mix of frustration and embarrassment washing over her. She could feel the judge's gaze on her, sharp and critical. Had her daughter's innocent request just ruined everything? Had Emma's outburst destroyed any chance of mercy? Before Lara could respond, Judge Callisto, who had been silently watching the exchange, lifted his eyes from the papers in front of him. His expression didn't change, but there was something about the way his brows raised slightly that caught Lara off guard. Instead of the anger she had expected, there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Did you say hamburgers, young lady?" Judge Callisto's voice was surprisingly gentle, softer than she had anticipated. His tone was not harsh or reprimanding, but full of an unexpected warmth that made Lara pause. Emma, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, hamburgers. I'm really hungry, and I like them with cheese," she added matter-of-factly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Lara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to expect next. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but before she could, something strange happened. Judge Callisto placed his hands flat on the desk in front of him and leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice calmer now, "I believe your daughter has a point. I'm sure we can all agree that hunger can make it hard to think straight. Perhaps a break is in order." Lara's eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. "A break, Your Honor?" she asked, uncertain if she had heard him right. Judge Callisto nodded slowly. "Yes, a break. Let us all take a moment, get a bit of fresh air. Maybe grab some lunch." Lara blinked, stunned. This wasn't the judge she had read about in the papers. The stern, unforgiving man who had never once shown a flicker of compassion was, in that moment, offering something she never could have anticipated: kindness. As murmurs rippled through the courtroom, Lara stood still, her mind racing. Could it be true? Was this really happening? The judge, seeing the confusion in her eyes, gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll reconvene shortly, Miss Thompson. I'll make sure your daughter's hunger is seen to. We'll finish this properly, but let's first address the human side of things." Lara's heart swelled. This wasn't just a break. It was a moment of unexpected grace. The weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter, and for the first time all morning, she felt a flicker of hope. Emma, still holding on to her mother's hand, smiled up at Judge Callisto. "Thank you, Judge," she said innocently, her voice soft but sincere. Judge Callisto chuckled, a rare sound in his courtroom. "You're welcome, young lady," he said warmly, his eyes glinting with something Lara had never expected to see. Humor, kindness, understanding. As the room began to stir, and the gallery murmured in surprise at the judge's unexpected compassion, Lara realized that, for once, things might actually turn out okay. The unexpected plea. Lara's anxiety had reached a new high, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear anything else. Her gaze never left the judge, who was still engrossed in the papers before him, his brow furrowing further with each turn of the page. The courtroom had grown quieter, the tension palpable in the air, the weight of expectations thick around her. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers clutching her purse, as if holding on to something tangible in the midst of this surreal experience. Emma, however, seemed blissfully unaware of the suffocating tension in the room. She still stood next to her mother, her small hand wrapped around Lara's fingers, that gentle and comforting touch. But then, just as the silence seemed unbearable, it was shattered by a voice. A small, high-pitched voice, innocent and unpretentious, filled the room. "Excuse me, sir, are we going to get hamburgers?" It was Emma. Lara froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel her face flush with embarrassment as her eyes widened, her stomach sinking. Of all the things that could have happened, this was the last thing she could have expected. The entire courtroom seemed to pause, as if time itself had taken a breath. For a moment, Lara thought the room might explode with laughter, but then, to her shock, an uncomfortable silence descended. All eyes were on Emma. Lara felt her skin prickle with heat. Her daughter's innocent question, a simple request, the kind of thing any child might ask when they were hungry or tired, had disrupted the fragile atmosphere in the courtroom. The murmurs of the crowd seemed to rise like a collective gasp. They all knew that a child's innocent interruption was both a moment of levity and, in this case, a serious breach of decorum. Lara's stomach twisted. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had hoped that bringing Emma would make the judge see her as a mother, struggling to do what was right. But now, it felt like everything was slipping away. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered in 1,000 directions. What had just happened? How could Emma not understand the seriousness of this moment? Lara had spent days preparing, trying to keep her composure, rehearsing what she would say to the judge. But in one instant, Emma had undone it all. Lara knelt down quickly, her knees creaking as she lowered herself to her daughter's level. She whispered, almost pleading, "Emma, baby, it's not polite to interrupt. We have to wait until the judge is done." She tried to smile, but the words felt hollow as they left her mouth. Emma blinked up at her, her wide eyes confused. She didn't understand the situation. All she knew was that she was hungry. The judge, however, had not reacted with the anger Lara expected. Judge Callisto, for all his sternness, didn't seem furious. In fact, his brow had lifted slightly, a subtle sign of surprise, but his expression remained mostly unchanged. His eyes, sharp and focused, moved slowly toward Emma. "Did you say hamburgers, young lady?" The judge's voice was calm, measured, though there was a faint glimmer of something softer in his tone. Lara froze. She didn't know what to expect next. The courtroom was still, everyone hanging on the judge's next words. But rather than rebuke, Judge Callisto's voice was almost gentle. Emma nodded, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Yes, sir. Hamburgers. I'm really hungry." The judge's eyes softened for a brief moment, as if he was seeing something beyond the simple request for food. The tension in the room seemed to shift. People had expected an angry reprimand, perhaps a sharp order to restore order in the courtroom, but instead, the judge was looking at Emma with a kind of understanding that no one could have anticipated. Lara, still kneeling beside her daughter, was unsure how to react. Was this a bad sign? Was the judge annoyed by the interruption? Or was something else happening here? Judge Callisto's gaze returned to the papers before him. But this time, there was a pause. A long, deliberate pause. Lara held her breath. She was terrified that her daughter's innocent words might have sealed her fate, turning a slim chance of mercy into an impenetrable wall of indifference. She expected the judge to raise his gavel and demand order, perhaps even dismiss the case as one unworthy of his attention. But then, to her surprise, he spoke again, his voice low but steady. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, addressing Lara for the first time since the proceedings began. "You have a child who, I can see, has a very straightforward way of asking for what she needs. I admire that." Lara blinked, not sure she had heard him correctly. She had expected to be reprimanded for her daughter's interruption. But instead, the judge was acknowledging something completely unexpected. She had come here hoping for mercy, but now she was unsure whether she had misread everything. Was this a trick? A test? Judge Callisto continued, his eyes never leaving the documents on the desk. "I understand your situation, Mrs. Thompson. You've come here to plead your case, but it's clear that you're facing an uphill battle, and I can appreciate that. I can also see the strength you're showing in trying to provide for your daughter, despite all the challenges you're facing." Lara felt her breath catch in her throat. Was he actually listening to her? Was he going to give her a chance? "I believe in second chances," the judge added, his voice steady. "But that second chance isn't just about forgiving a mistake. It's about seeing the bigger picture, the whole story. You're here because you made a series of choices that led to this point. But that doesn't define you. Lara's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. Was the judge actually showing empathy? I am going to offer you an alternative to this fine, Judge Callisto continued. But in exchange, you'll need to prove that you're willing to take responsibility and make things right. Lara's mind raced as the judge laid out the terms. He was giving her a chance, a real chance. But the road ahead was not going to be easy. She would have to work harder than ever before to regain control of her life, to show that she could be the mother Emma needed, the person she had always hoped to be. Emma, still oblivious to the weight of the conversation, looked up at Lara with her bright, trusting eyes, and whispered, "So, hamburgers." Lara couldn't help but smile. In that moment, despite everything, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new, something that would not only change their lives, but teach her the power of resilience and unexpected kindness. The judge's silent reflection. The courtroom held its breath, a collective pause that felt like an eternity. Lara's face flushed with heat, and she felt the sting of embarrassment burn deep into her cheeks. It wasn't Emma's fault. She was just a little girl, after all. But the timing, it couldn't have been worse. Lara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the growing sense of panic. She glanced at Emma, who stood there oblivious to the weight of her actions, her wide eyes still expectant. The little girl's gaze never wavered from the judge's stern face, her innocent question hanging in the air. The murmurs of the crowd started to swell, a sea of hushed whispers and stifled chuckles, each voice carrying a judgment of its own. But then, something unexpected happened. Judge Callisto, the very man known for his unyielding demeanor and strict approach to the law, did not immediately scold or reprimand. His gaze, usually sharp and calculating, softened for just a moment. His brows lifted slightly, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. He didn't bark orders or even raise his voice. Instead, he sat there for a long beat, processing. His gaze shifted from Emma to Lara, then back again. His expression remained composed, but there was something in his eyes, something that wasn't just the cold calculation of a judge assessing a case. Lara didn't know whether to be relieved or more anxious. The silence stretched, thick and uncertain, and she felt the weight of every second. "Did you say hamburgers, young lady?" The judge's voice broke the stillness, but it was different. The usual sternness was gone. His tone was not filled with reprimand, but with an unexpected curiosity. Emma, still standing innocently beside her mother, nodded vigorously, her small face lighting up with a smile that could have melted the hardest of hearts. "Yes, hamburgers. Mom promised I could have one if we got through this." She beamed up at Lara, who, in that moment, felt a jolt of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Warmth. The judge's eyes softened even further as he looked at Lara, then back at Emma. The courtroom, once filled with an air of tension and judgment, had transformed. Even the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as they awaited the judge's response. Lara, still mortified by the situation, leaned down to Emma's level, her voice low and urgent. "Emma, sweetheart, it's not polite to interrupt. You need to be quiet now." But Emma, completely unaware of the grown-up complexities of the moment, merely shrugged and whispered in her mother's ear, "But I'm hungry, Mom." Lara felt a surge of both pride and guilt. Here was Emma, so pure and straightforward, so free from the burden of grown-up worries. In a world where things were often complicated and hard to explain, Emma's simple desire for food, for comfort, for something familiar in the midst of chaos, struck Lara deeply. She realized that she, too, was hungry, hungry for something more than just food. She was hungry for hope, hungry for a way out of this suffocating cycle of hardship, hungry for something to change. And then something even more unexpected happened. Judge Callisto's stern face remained calm, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a kind of understanding, a fleeting connection that Lara couldn't quite explain. For a moment, it felt as if the weight of the world was lifting, and all of the tension in the room evaporated. "Lara Thompson," Judge Callisto said, his voice measured but softer than it had been before. "I understand that things are tough. I know what it's like to feel trapped by circumstances beyond your control. But this little one," he gestured to Emma, "has a right to be heard too. And I think, perhaps, it's time for all of us to remember what it feels like to be a little bit hungry for something other than just food." Lara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Was he showing compassion? Was this judge, known for his rigid adherence to the law, actually showing empathy? A silence fell once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. The kind that comes with realization. The kind that comes with the breaking of a barrier. The kind that comes with the flicker of kindness in the most unexpected of places. Judge Callisto leaned forward, placing his hands on the bench in front of him, his eyes never leaving Lara or Emma. "I'm going to give you a chance, Miss Thompson. I'm going to waive the fines. But," he paused, allowing the words to sink in, "you'll have to pay it forward. Do something good for someone else. Don't let this be the end of it. Don't let this little one see you give up. You're stronger than you think." Lara's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with emotion. She hadn't expected this. In fact, she had never even imagined it. The weight she had been carrying seemed to lighten, just a little. And it wasn't because the fines had been waived, though that alone felt like a miracle. It was because someone who didn't know her story or understand her struggles, had reached out to her with a simple act of kindness. He had given her a chance, not just to get out of this mess, but to make something better of herself and her daughter. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lara felt the smallest spark of hope. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She hadn't realized until now just how much she needed those words. The judge nodded, his face returning to its usual composure, but his eyes lingered for just a moment longer. Then he turned his attention to the next case on the docket. The courtroom, once heavy with tension, felt lighter now. The crowd began to stir, the quiet hum of conversation returning. But Lara remained still, a mix of disbelief and gratitude swirling in her chest. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Does this mean we can have hamburgers now?" Lara smiled through the tears that threatened to spill, kneeling down to embrace her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to have hamburgers, and we're going to be okay." As they left the courtroom, Lara felt the weight of her struggle shift. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot. But now she had a new sense of determination. And as she walked out with Emma, hand in hand, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as she had once believed. A gesture of grace. The courtroom fell completely still as Judge Callisto's question hung in the air. Lara could barely process the words. Her thoughts were racing, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of emotion and confusion. Why hadn't he scolded Emma? Why hadn't he raised his gavel and admonished them both for the interruption? Instead, his voice, though calm and measured, was softer than she ever could have imagined. Emma's face lit up as though she had been waiting for the exact moment to say what was on her mind. "Yes, sir. Hamburgers," she repeated enthusiastically, her hands clasped in front of her like a prayer. Lara's heart sank. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She hadn't meant for her daughter to disrupt the proceedings, to bring this moment to a halt. She had been hoping for mercy, for a judge who might see past the numbers and understand the hardship she was enduring. But now, it seemed, Emma had made it worse. However, as the moments stretched, Lara noticed something. Judge Callisto's lips, which had been tight in concentration, now curved into the slightest of smiles. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, a crack in the judge's otherwise unyielding composure. The crowd in the gallery had quieted down as well, most people now looking between the little girl and the judge with curiosity, wondering what would happen next. For the briefest moment, Lara thought she saw the judge's usual sternness melt into something different, something almost human. "Hamburgers, you say?" Judge Callisto repeated, this time with a small chuckle that caught everyone off guard. "Well, I suppose a little girl's request can't be ignored, can it?" Lara blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Was he laughing? "I'll tell you what," Judge Callisto continued, standing up slowly and adjusting the cuff of his robe. His voice, though still authoritative, carried a warmth that felt foreign but welcome. "After we finish here, I'll make sure you get those hamburgers, young lady. But first, let's focus on what brought us here today." Lara's mouth fell open in shock, her mind struggling to process what had just transpired. The judge, a man she had feared would be her worst adversary, had just made a gesture that none of the courtroom had expected. He had lightened the atmosphere, breaking through the tension with a simple, unexpected kindness. But there was more. As Lara sat there, still processing, Judge Callisto turned his attention back to her. His eyes softened, just for a moment, as if he had finally recognized something beneath the surface. Lara could feel her own breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was pity, understanding, or perhaps a rare moment of genuine humanity, but it made her heart flutter with a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice steady, but with a new weight to it, "I understand your predicament. I can see that this is not just about a parking fine. This is about more than numbers. This is about the struggle to make ends meet. It's about your daughter. And most importantly, it's about your determination to stand here, to try and do right by her, even in the face of adversity." Lara felt tears prickle at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to truly understand, not like this. She hadn't expected a judge, of all people, to see the deeper layers of her life. The quiet battles she fought every single day to provide, to protect, to give Emma the best future she could. "You've got a lot on your plate, and I'm not blind to that," Judge Callisto continued. "We all go through hard times, but it's how we rise from those times that defines us." Lara opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. She had wanted to plead with the judge, to ask for his mercy, but now she felt a different kind of emotion welling up inside her. Gratitude, mixed with a sense of disbelief. For a moment, it felt like she was not just another case before him. She felt seen. Judge Callisto turned to the clerk beside him and made a few quick notations in his book. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper seemed oddly calming in the stillness of the room. When he was done, he looked back at Lara and Emma. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to waive the fines today. I'm not going to add any more pressure to your already difficult situation. But I will need you to make sure this doesn't happen again. Please be more mindful in the future. Consider this your second chance." Lara blinked in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Whoa, what? You're waiving the fines?" "Yes," Judge Callisto replied. His voice was steady, but there was a kindness in his eyes now, a softness that seemed to defy the stern reputation he had built for himself over the years. "I think you've earned that much. You're doing your best. Sometimes that's all we can do." Lara couldn't believe what she was hearing. It felt like a dream. A fleeting moment of grace when everything she had been carrying was suddenly lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Emma, who was still standing next to her, gazing up at the judge with those wide, trusting eyes. Emma's innocence, her honesty, had somehow unlocked something inside the judge that no plea or legal argument ever could. "Thank you," Lara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Callisto nodded once, as if to say that his decision had not been made lightly, but that he understood. Then, with a final glance at the little girl who had unintentionally brought about this moment of kindness, he added, "And Emma, when we're done here, I'll make sure you get your hamburgers. I'm a man of my word." The room seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating like smoke in the wind. Lara couldn't help but laugh softly, feeling the weight of the world lifting off her chest. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a moment of grace, of unexpected compassion, that had turned a daunting day into one of hope. As she stood up, Feeling lighter than she had in weeks, she looked at Emma, whose eyes sparkled with innocent joy. It wasn't just a meal they had been promised. It was something far more valuable. A reminder that kindness and mercy still existed in the most unlikely places. And for the first time in a long while, Lara felt that everything might just be okay.